Welcome to the Future Ready CMO webinar series, where we explore ideas, inspiration, and techniques to become the leaders we need to be to change the world. This is an open forum of marketers, change leaders, and futurists committed to leveraging the force of our commercial markets to drive positive outcomes for our planet, our people, and our collective future. Today, we continue our journey exploring leadership concepts that are helping shape our future. I'm personally excited for the opportunity to speak with Thomas Kolster, Mr. Goodvertising himself, and a man on a mission to make business put people and planet first. I've personally been exploring the edges of the sustainable brands and innovation community for many years, and I first met Thomas at the Sustainable Brands Conference about 12 years ago. Since then, his work has inspired me to go deeper and get involved. And he's got new work coming out that's inspiring me more and more because I think it's being driven more by a sense of urgency that we're all feeling right now. So for those of you not familiar with his work, Thomas is a seasoned branding and sustainability professional, counting more than 18 years advising Fortune 500 companies, small startups, governments, communications agencies, and nonprofits. He's the founder of the global Goodvertising movement that has inspired a shift in advertising for the better. And we're all about that here. So he's also the author of 2 books, Goodvertising and The Hero Trap, and a globally recognized speaker inspiring audiences at events like TEDx, South by Southwest, DAD. What is that, Thomas? I don't even know what DAD is.
We'll get back to that.
Okay. And Sustainable Brands. He's also a columnist for The Guardian, Adweek, The Drum, and more. He's launched several impact platforms like CPH Change and Where Good Grows. At the end of this webinar, we'll talk a bit about his emerging venture, Climate Punk, which sounds like we need that now. So, Thomas, welcome. You've been at the forefront of this. It's great to have you here. And you've been at the forefront of this Brands for Change movements for many, many years. And we're talking about this whole fatigue, and I know you're going to get into that. And what I understand now is that you've come a bit full circle from purpose-driven to post-purpose, which was a new concept for me 3 months ago. So you've identified this notion of a transformative brand and the impact that can have on the world. I know that everyone here is excited to learn about that. And so I'm not going to take a lot more time here. I'm just going to get out of your way and let you do your magic. But for our webinar guests, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and we'll spend some time at the end answering them. So Thomas, over to you.
Thank you so much. And first of all, thank you for hosting this important conversation. I feel that change you just touched on, talking about brands to actually talking about leadership, I think is so important, that we actually also take responsibility in terms of the work and the output. And I think for me, at least, the journey over the last 15 years in this purpose space woke me up to something's got to change. And I think one of the key things that I'm going to say a lot today is probably, the urgency and how we actually drive change, how we inspire people to take action. Because I think for those of you who, sit with a brand today and with the brand challenge, I think one of the key things I always heard was that, wait a moment, we're not seeing enough of demand. People are not buying our sort of ESG efforts. People aren't buying sustainable products enough. If they were, we would of course be supporting them on that journey. So with the last piece of work, that was one of the key things I sort of wanted to explore. And hopefully today we can have a bit of an exciting conversation. So
Great.
Whatever I put out there, I'll see if I can do a little break halfway through the little presentation. As you said, Mary, put some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
And where did we actually, I'm trying to remember, was when we met. That's going to be San Diego, right? Wasn't it in
San Diego? I think it was like 12,
Yes.
13 years ago. Yeah.
I'm going to be back. I'm going to be back this year as well for
great.
An undefined session. And DAD, which stands for DNAD, just to clarify that one, is you have Cannes Lions, which is sort of global advertising award show and conference, and DNAD is basically a parallel to that, but owned by the industry, for the industry, run out of the UK. So I've done work with them for many years. I mean, they started their first sort of impact focused award called the White
Mm,
Pencil, more or less
mm,
when my first book came out, Good Advertising. So it's just one of those organizations that if you guys are not familiar with DNAD and DNAD Impact, it's actually a really, really good place to look for inspiration
right.
and some exciting stuff.
I'll
Yeah.
check it out. Cool. All right.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to go off camera, get out of your way, and you let us know when we want to take a break.
Exactly. Anyway, so I'm calling in from Denmark today, Copenhagen, Denmark, and I'll be sharing some of the work and thoughts that I've had over the last couple of years, and also focus in on purpose. For the most part, I feel purpose is a bit like Pokemon. Everybody is searching for it, but nobody really knows why. So hopefully we can, or I can give you some answers, and it also give you different way of looking at purpose. So let's dive into this little presentation here today. So just to give a bit of background, I come from the creative side of the industry, and my sort of light bulb moment, my sort of awakening in the climate space was one very specific event that happened here in Copenhagen, because we were hosting the climate summit, the COP15 at the time. Now we have another one coming up in Dubai very, very soon in November. And that was probably the first time I witnessed brands suddenly talking about something else and just sort of plugging products. But they talked about environmental responsibility, et cetera, et cetera. But there was another thing that sort of woke me up, because I obviously had very high expectations to our elected government leaders to do something about the climate crisis. We had Tony Blair, we had Barack Obama, we had all the big presidential hotshots in there. And this was sort of what happened. Not a lot came out of that, and that's why I asked myself the question. I'm sure that, and I know from a conversation I had with Mary earlier, that it's a question she asked herself as well, with being in this profession, advertising, marketing, what is it we could do? And at the age of 30, I wrote my first book, Good Advertising, that Mary just showcased, which is sort of like a pretty heavy book. So obviously, as you can see on the image there, much younger Thomas. Believe it or not, at that time, it was tough to find any great examples of purpose work out there. And obviously, it showcases a lot of different campaigns from all over the world. This was the beginning of Unilever's journey, when that year they launched the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. There's quite a few campaigns from them in this book. And also, admittedly, what's quite interesting today is that when I look back at this piece of work, and some of the work that I looked at as best practice, is a piece of work from Honda that won our Grand Prix in Cannes that year. And today, looking at it, I probably would say that's greenwashing. But that also showcases how difficult it is to navigate this. And I think the last, especially 2 to 3 years, I am witnessing a pushback, and I think we all see this in the US at the moment as well, how ESG and sustainability and climate is being politicized. But so in some aspects, I'm born an optimist, I think, but I'm also, probably because of what we're witnessing right now with forest fires, with drought, with flooding, etc., becoming increasingly pessimistic. One of the sort of moments that I look at, and it might sound strange, but one of the moments I look at as a potential hope for what we're doing in advertising and marketing was in fact COVID. Because if we think about it, this is probably, in my lifetime at least, the first time I've seen all of us change our habits, where we started asking ourselves different questions, when we started shopping less. And obviously, because we know that with the planetary footprints we have at the moment, we are putting the planet pretty much off balance. I mean, there was just a report out today that Danes have a climate footprint around 13 tons. And we're about to, or the aim that we're looking at, the 1.5 degrees is down at 3 tons. And I think if we look to the US, it's more or less the same numbers. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But I did see this collective effort of people actually stopping up, and it had effect. But obviously now we're back at normal. Unfortunately, we're back at revenge shopping, revenge traveling, and so it does seem like even though we should have learned something from COVID, we haven't. And what seems even more frightening at the moment is that the license to operate as an industry, I think, is being much more challenged than we ever seen before. I think from inside our industry, I do see protest movement around banning fossil fuels in terms of saying no to working with aviation clients, no to working with car clients. And I think this is one of the things we probably should talk a little bit about at the end of this presentation. But we also see a pushback from people who are saying, at the moment, luckily, taking non-violent action in terms of bringing attention to the climate emergency. But I think it's about, I think it's just a matter of time before we might see this turn violent as well. But my second awakening and my second book I wrote is called The Hero Trap. And that came out of this thing that from having very few brands that talked about purpose and having very few brands that talked about issues such as sustainability, pride, etc., it suddenly seemed like you could not go into the supermarket without everybody sort of pitching themselves as some sort of new Mother Teresa or Gandhi, etc. Secondly, I also had to take a hard look at my own lifestyle and actually ask myself, Thomas, are you actually living sustainably enough? And that's why I felt that we are entering a sort of new sort of marketplace where we have to ask ourselves the questions, who can we in fact trust when we see all these communication efforts of brands trying to pretend to be heroes? Who can we trust? And another question, and I'll you're more than welcome to answer this already in the chat, but with all these so-called purposeful brands out there, what brand, or it can even be a leader, what brand or leader have in fact created change in your life? So think about that. What brand or leader have created tangible change in your life? Because my issue at the moment with the branding landscape and that advertising and marketing landscape is, as I said, that it looks like this. Every brand being incredibly busy talking about all the great stuff that they're doing. And I really feel that we need to change that sort of too good to be true ways of creating brands. It's almost like we moved from creating brands where it was about toothpaste that created the greatest, the most white smile, to now how great that toothpaste is for the planet, and that's not very believable. So what I want to share with you today is a concrete tool or different way that you can work with leadership. Because if we look at how most brands went into this space, and I did the same mistakes in my first book, Good Advertising, when I started building purposeful brands, I put the very brand at the center. And this is an example from Patagonia. And if you listen to what Patagonia is saying, we're in the business to save our home planet. That is some very self-glorifying, self-important stuff from a company that basically does t-shirts. I mean, their current and recent actions, obviously, from Patagonia showcase that they're one of the companies that can probably get away with these types of statements, but I would say that 99% of people probably won't. So words that are too good to be true. So I think we need to change that, because that's what we're seeing on a continuous basis from Target, from others that go out and say, we are the activist, and people create a pushback. The second thing we need to figure out is we need to create change. We are, as I said, my planetary footprint way too high. we have very, very little time to act. So brands obviously need to think about how can they create change internally in terms of cleaning up their supply and supply chains, et cetera, and lower their carbon footprint, but obviously also in the hands of people. So, and the other thing is, how do we actually figure out the business case for purpose? Back in the days, it was easy. When I wrote good advertising, one of the key things I kept saying was, if you do good for people and planet, it will be good for brand and bottom line. But suddenly, when that market is extremely crowded, we don't see the same correlation. We don't see the same business case for purpose. And yet what we want to figure out is obviously, and these are some numbers from Sustainable Brands, the organization that Mary and I just mentioned before. They have a global gathering coming up in mid-October. But these numbers are from them, and they talk about 65% of people say that they want to buy from so-called purposeful companies, but only 26% follow through. So there's this 39% gap, which made me curious. First of all, how can we build the business case? We can build a business case if we can lessen that gap. Secondly, we can also inspire people to create change. And maybe it's not so different that there is this gap, the 39% gap, because if you think about it, take the New Year's resolutions. That's usually the analogy I use. Every time we reach New Year's, I think we have very high expectations of the change that we can enable in our own lives. And into January, the running shoes are still lying there in the corridor. So maybe just think about some of the New Year's resolutions that you have had over the time, and whether those were successful. So what I wanted to focus on was, instead of actually pitching the brand as the leader, what happens if we suddenly start pitching people as the leader, as the one that creates the change? So let me give you one example of that, and then I'm going to show you a model who can help you think differently about how you create change. So one of the best ways of obviously lessening your carbon footprint is through what we eat. And Mary and I had a long chat before all of you joined about regenerative agriculture. But one of the brands that I looked to was a brand called Ørsted, and it's a Danish company. And basically what they do, they come with this box of farm fresh produce they deliver to my door. But what's even more interesting is that it also comes with a recipe. So that way they teach me how to eat more plant-based, how to eat more vegan. But they're not on the same sort of activist mission that we saw from Patagonia that talks about we're in the business to save our home planet. They take a different approach. When I interviewed the founder for my book, he talked about what he called Earth Connection, something that all of us need to find ourselves, this connection with cooking, this connection with the produce. And from a marketing point of view, it's also quite interesting, because when that brand helped me on my journey towards change and I'm successful, nobody has to pay me as a micro-influencer or whatever, because when I've succeeded creating a beautiful vegan pie, I'm obviously gonna share it with all of you on my Instagram account, although most likely the reality of that change look slightly different. So in my early years of building brands with purpose, obviously I think all of us was inspired by a book like Simon Sinek's Start With Whys. But in a marketplace where everybody talks about their why and their purpose, how can we actually create something that's authentic? So that's why I started thinking about the why that we need to find is in fact the why that all of us have in terms of the journeys that we are on, the brands that actually help us achieve things, like Ørsted helped me create plant-based food and taught me how to cook more plant-based. And I have a model for that called the arrow, because I really wanted to understand how we drive change and how we create this, how we bridge this gap of 39%. And the arrow was inspired by coaching and psychotherapy, because those two disciplines are goal-oriented. So the arrow fundamentally asks 4 different questions, and you can use this in terms of leadership as well. We've worked with leaders using this model as well. We work with organizations and others using this model. But the first question is obviously, what is it that you do that shouldn't give you too much of a headache? If you're the Nikes of this world, that might be the running shoes, the athletic gear, or whatever. The second one is, how are you unique in delivering your product or service? Maybe those Nike gear is made by athletes, or whatever might be your claim to fame. But the third question is really the interesting one, because earlier what would happen is the brand would ask itself, why do I exist? And already start creating sort of this allure of self-importance, and you'd come out with statements like the one from Patagonia: "In the business to save our home planet." That's my driver. And I even see this so-called hero trap with a lot of startups that go out there and say, you know what, I was on a beach and then I discovered this ocean plastics, and now we want to rid all the oceans of ocean plastics. So very much an inside out way of looking at the world and creating leadership. When you're suddenly asking yourself the question, as a brand or as a leader, who can you help people become? You suddenly help people on their journey, on their change journey. You're suddenly pushing me towards, for example, embracing plant-based food. And I believe, and I call these transformative brands, and I believe in a world where there's so much purpose. And I asked you this question in the beginning: what brand or leader have in fact created change in your life? Now you certainly have a model that is focused on driving change in my life. And when we talk about authenticity, every brand can claim to be good or to be purposeful or whatever. But when I can feel the change in my life, like with Årstiderne, it's genuine. It's a journey that we're on together. The last question that I ask in this era model is when. So when can you enable this change? And this is about being that little push in the back, that little nudge, helping us strive further. I mean, for IKEA, for example, they very much talk about every day. So this is an everyday challenge to help people live more sustainably. Let me give you another example. This is a health insurance company called Discovery. They're in 7 markets, also operate in the US, but originally out of South Africa. What they talk about as what I call a transformative promise rather than a purpose is to incentivize people to live healthier. So this is something that resonates inside and outside the organization, because it's anchored in people's lives. It's anchored in the who, and its strive for us, most of us, obviously, to live healthier. What's so interesting about that is that it's propelled them to be one of the most innovative health insurance companies in the world. And they've been very successful in that. They, amongst other things, have a program called Discovery Vitality. And basically it's sort of built up like a reward program. But every time, for example, that you go and buy fruits and vegetables, you get rewarded. If Mary hits the gym, she gets rewarded. And that way they try and nudge the customers to live more healthy lives. Quite often when I worked with purpose back in the days, it quite often ended up being what I would call a two-headed purpose monster. Because the one side of the monster would say like profit, profit, profit. And the other one would say, hey, purpose, let's be kind, let's be good, and all that stuff. For those of us who have worked in organizations and worked in business, we know that quite often, unfortunately, it does seem that profit wins. But when those two things are intertwined, when Discovery is able to help their customers become healthier, they have to pay less in premiums. And they've been incredibly successful at doing that. They've done a survey with 200,000 people in collaboration with Apple, that little health app where they can actually track what people are doing. And the interesting thing is that the people who took part in the Vitality program exercised 4 days more per month. So quite an achievement. So in having this sort of transformative mindset, first of all, you're avoiding pitching yourself as the hero and the activist. Secondly, you're actually pushing people in the back, and your product or service is certainly playing what I would call a transformative role in people's lives. So where I see the marketing landscape heading right now, and especially in the US, where everything is so politicized, where it's very, very dangerous to put on the hero's cape and say we're the activists, because we will be seeing a pushback, is that in the early days of my journey, and with the first book, I very much talked with brands around what I would call sort of the societal promise. So a more environmentally friendly car, and that would drive brand differentiation. But today, I mean, the word sustainable is added in front of everything: sustainable concrete, sustainable office buildings. So no wonder that we are seeing, especially in the European Union, tightening regulation and pushback from a lot of that. So in a very crowded purpose market, I think, and entering into what I would call a post-purpose market, it's much more about the difference that you can play in people's lives, that transformative difference that I can feel, where the brand has actually helped me on my journey. And when I started looking at that even more closely and starting to study commercials and trying to understand this idea about if we can inspire people to act, which is very urgent and needed in this space, and secondly, if there is a way we can understand the business case better. So together with GfK, we did this study where we compared 20 classic purposeful commercials that look at the brand as the agent of change. In this case, a commercial from 2 years ago from Super Bowl, no, 1 year ago from Super Bowl, from Chipotle, where they talked about can a burrito save the world. Most of the narrative in that commercial was around sustainable farming. And then we compared that to 20 transformative commercials. In this case, a commercial from Dove. They have a long history from my first book, Good Advertising, to today, where they talk about a reverse selfie. Actually, this idea that how crazy our beauty ideals have become because of all these filters that are being added on Instagram and social media, and what happens when you sort of remove those. It's kind of funny to see that a decade later, because one of the most famous campaigns from Dove about a decade ago was this real beauty campaign that looked at good old outdoor advertising and how much Photoshop we obviously used at that time when we featured models, especially in the beauty and fashion categories. But what's really interesting here is that when we compare the two different ways, two different commercials, Dove being the transformative, with Chipotle being the purposeful one, people feel better about buying the product. We're much better at enabling some of the triggers. People want to search more about the brand. But lastly, which is the biggest difference, 10% difference, inspires me to be part of the change. So we do see a clear difference. It's not crystal clear when we look at age. There are some differences. So typically, the younger target audiences respond much better to transformative commercials, where it does seem like the older people become, there does seem to be a tendency towards still sort of liking a more purposeful approach. When that's being said, we need the urgency. We obviously need all of us to think about and put that on the marketing plan, how we can lessen the carbon footprint of our products. So I think that's key in this day and time. I love this little ad word. It's from a German supermarket chain, and no, it's not a discount, but they quite cleverly explain how you can, in fact, this time save 66% of the carbon emissions, thanks to some of the work that they have been doing in terms of sourcing, etc. So a clever way of actually showcasing this. But also think we really need to think about how do we create those urgent shifts. We know food can change a lot. How do we change the way we produce food, but also help people out there, for example, eat more plant-based? If you are in the fashion industry, how do you think about prolonging textiles? How do you think about recollecting textiles? All these things where people can participate. And this year in Cannes, I saw this session from Mark Pritchard, the global CMO from P&G. He's also part of my latest book, The Hero Trap, where he share some of the campaigns that they have done, some of the transformative campaigns that they've been doing in this space. And in Can, he also shared this thing about how, I don't know how many of you do it, this is a continuous discussion with my girlfriend, whether we should rinse the dishes before we put them in the dishwasher or if we shouldn't. Typically, the rinsers tend to win, the one that insist on rinsing the dishes before they're being put in there. But obviously, the piece of work here that they've done for the Cascade brand was just saying, you know, scrape, load, done, and actually really driving an important conversation that drove them to become a category leader, saving water and actually changing behavior. So really focusing and taking a much more transformative approach. I've been talking a lot here, so just a quick little feedback just to check in if you're still live out there. But I'm going to show you two types of commercials, pretty old ones. And then I sort of want to hear your thoughts about these two different types of adverts here. Let's begin with the first one. You know, elections coming up soon. This was just on the just before last election cycle in the US, and Patagonia in one of their collections launched or put this little tag in the neck of one of their collections where they said vote the assholes out. And then let's compare that with this commercial from United Colors of Benetton, for those of you who still remember that brand and how vocal they were back in the days. I remember that was some work that I held in quite high esteem back in the days. I don't know how we should do this. If anybody want to chip in, or we should do a thing in the chat. People can maybe also just in the chat just write a favorite. So any favorites for the first one from Patagonia? You're also welcome to you know, obviously voice up. You're also just welcome to write in the chat. Any Patagonia fans, you can write Patagonia. If you're a fan of the United Colors of Benetton ad, then write United Colors of Benetton. Good. Let's see if people can in fact chat here, and if
Yeah, I'm
not,
not sure if we
that's
can.
also
Yeah.
okay. No problem about that. So let's just go back and I can share a little bit about those two different approaches. So, and there's no right and wrong necessarily in this. As I said, for me, it's been a journey in terms of how I viewed this. What they're sold out is obviously typically a purpose-led commercial where the brand pitches itself as the activist, and the second one is obviously much more of a transformative commercial where we start to think about the biases and stereotypes that we might hold in our lives. And the big difference is obviously that if you go out as a brand and you say, look at us, we are very diverse, as we've seen with Google and others, the problem is when you put on that cape, you will fall down like a can of soup. People can criticize you. Whereas if you take a much more subtle approach, a much more transformative approach, and try to get people to think, it's a much less risk. Secondly, there's also a high chance of people actually following through and thinking about some of this stuff. What's really important and interesting about transformation these days is, in fact, that, and I'm sure that a lot of you can recognize that, at least for this was something that was very, very clear to me during the pandemic, this idea that the best things in life aren't things. I think a lot of us started asking deeper questions, such as the meaning of work, what we should be spending our time on, all this stuff. And Google do this yearly survey where they look at what are people actually searching for globally. And the one thing that came out in 2022 was, in fact, can I change? So I think a lot of us are on this sort of transformative journey where we ask ourselves a lot of questions. This is a real opportunity for brands to play a meaningful role in people's lives. I don't think purpose is necessarily, it's not that purpose has lost its meaning. The problem is if you don't know what meaning you want to have and what transformative and meaningful difference you're playing in people's life, then it loses its purpose. Then purpose loses its meaning. And the interesting thing about this is also that when we start having a more transformative mindset, we also come out of this consumption cycle where it's all about buying more. Our industry is obviously proven in terms of adding to the GDP. It is proven that every little pound, every little dollar that's invested in advertising obviously drives consumption. So what if it's not tied to buying stuff? And I think that was one of the key things, as I said, during the pandemic, where suddenly people were baking sourdough bread. People were like picking up the guitar. I had this crazy idea that I had to go back and practice playing synthesizer. But if you think about it from a brand perspective, what are some of the things that you can teach people? Like, for example, Årstiderne that I showed you earlier that taught me to cook plant-based, or for example, Discovery that urged people to pick up a sport and exercise a bit more. What are some of those things? If we take IKEA, we all know what IKEA is famous for, right? Breaking up couples, obviously. Every time you go into an IKEA store, you always end up in an argument. If you ever find someone where you can go into an IKEA in peace and not get into an argument, marry that person. Very important advice. But obviously, IKEA is also known for their mega malls. But as we see right now, they're rolling out across the world much smaller store that they can insert into the city, because obviously the fabrics of the cities are changing. But also what's really interesting about these so-called planning studios is that you can go in there, and then behind a screen sits a couple of designers who can help you sort of design your dream home, and hopefully a more sustainable dream home, so that they give you a service in a much more different way. And I think this is really, really pivotal in a time where we see retail failing. And I know why it's failing, in the sense that why should I go down in a store, have maybe less of an overview of the products? I don't really feel like I can compare the prices in the same way. Most of the time, the service aren't that great. So maybe think about how your brand, how your organization can work much more around sort of transformative experiences, teaching the new stuff. I mean, IKEA have everything from sort of circular workshops to plant-based cooking classes. If you look at the Nike store in Soho in New York, it's sort of like a showcase of having fun with your gear, meeting athletes, all these things. It feels much more like an interactive museum than a shop. And also, if we look at our cities, this is also changing, because to be honest, cities for the most part was made for one thing, and that was consuming. And it's so great to see now that cities are actually starting to view us as wholesome citizens that want to obviously live healthier lives. And this is an example from the harbor of Copenhagen, where they rolled out these urban gyms. This is something I witnessed across the planet, from Chile, South Africa. So it's interesting to see how that also changes the perspective. And this is something I think we as marketeers can learn from as well, not looking at people as solely consumers, but more as citizens, as people who we can teach and learn new things. And this fundamentally comes back to this idea about leadership. I don't know how you feel about the leaders that you have had in your life, but the best leaders I have had in my life have been those who have helped me achieve great stuff. A creative director who pushed me further, who inspired me to see the world differently. And I think this is where I believe that transformative brands are so important. Because when they start the question, who can you help people become, they naturally take on much more of a coach role and help us become the heroes of our own lives. And in this urgent time where we as marketeers really need to step up and act and inspire people to act, if we are to succeed, to cut down on the planetary footprint, the way too fat and heavy planetary footprint we have right now, We need to understand what it takes to unlock change. I don't know how many of you have tried to quit smoking or maybe change another difficult habit. But if we take smoking as an example, your loved ones can tell you to quit those cigarettes. Your doctor can warn you and tell you from a scientific point of view why you should change those, why you should quit those cigarettes. Your children, even on the packaging, they can try and warn you and put on an image of these cancer-ridden lungs. It doesn't work. The only thing you do is actually, as a smoker, is avoiding the campaign. Why I'm saying this is that if you want to create change, the only one who can create change in your own life is you. And that's why I started with this tongue-in-cheek image of Jesus in the beginning, because I really do think that we need to take a fundamentally different look at purpose and how we inspire and create change. And it begins with really moving away from pitching ourselves as the hero, but turning everybody into the heroes in their own lives. Second, it's very, very easy. Just that small question, who can I help people become, fundamentally changes the way that not only you view your leadership, but also the way that you create your campaigns, your activities, etc., where you actually turn people into fellow folks on a shared journey towards, for example, living healthier or cutting down on your carbon emissions. And lastly, obviously, as an industry that are so intertwined with consumption, we need to think about how we can redefine growth towards human betterment. I'm not saying we're going to solve that in this little webinar here today, but we need to think about it in terms of the services, etc., we're launching. And in my book, The Hero Trap, I have quite a few examples of companies who've done quite an interesting service and product pivot. If you're curious about knowing a little bit more about the Hero Trap, I've added this little QR code. So for the not so techie people, you can hold up your iPhone or whatever phone you have. This is not an endorsement of Apple. Take a photo and you can follow that link, and you can download a compact version, free compact version of my latest book, The Hero Trap. And on the website, you can also see something about my earlier book, Advertising. And obviously, I will encourage you, obviously, to follow me. My role is obviously to inspire and enable positive change, something that I believe very much in. But now, time for the most interesting part of this conversation, obviously feedback and questions from all of you. And now I can finally see a bit of the chat as well.
Chat going on here. Yep.
Good.
All right. Well, while we wait for questions to come in, I've got a couple of my own, because I'm just sort of listening to you talk about the sort of movement from purpose washing, if you will, or purpose messaging to activation. A couple of things stood out to me. One is that, yeah, the messaging is getting stronger and more motivating, but then some brands are actually incorporating motivators. Like when you talk about stopping smoking, you've got to have like a motivator, the little rubber band on your arm, or like in the case of Discovery Vitality, they had the points, right? Or the rewards that you get for going to the gym that actually change your behavior. Is there a magic formula that you have discovered of messaging, and then the carrot or the behavior changing gamification or device, if you will?
I think there's a lot of different levers that we look at in the book. And there's a methodology there that we share as well. But obviously, it also depends on people. I think some people are very sort of more collectively driven, so motivated by an extrinsic behavior. Others are motivated by an intrinsic behavior. So, for example, what was so interesting during the pandemic was we saw that, for example, in Denmark, there was this idea that standing up to COVID was a societal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
This was something we did together and as a nation, and that worked really well. That resonated really well. We're a smaller country, and that was something that actually got people to think twice about it, because if you didn't follow through, people were frowned upon, people were looked at, with disbelief. Um, and so, but it sort of really depends on the person, the situation, what type of behavior change that we want to enact. But I really do think that this is sort of the next frontier of what we will see in the sustainability space, in the fact that hopefully, depending on who's listening in today,
Yeah.
but as we see, for example, with IKEA, the first many years were on a journey and still are in terms of cleaning up the supply chains, getting FSC labeled wood, etc., etc. But obviously now they're also looking at the big, massive responsibility they have is obviously getting their customers to live more sustainably, to
Yeah.
inspire them to put on solar panels on the roof, inspire them to put on and adopt LED light bulbs. Sweden is just next door. IKEA is from Sweden.
Yeah.
You're from there. Have,
Yeah.
have Nordic heritage as well, and a thing. When I was a kid, you'd go to IKEA, and you'd get your meatballs with mashed potatoes. That was sort of the highlight of your little trip to IKEA, at least as a kid. And today, they have, with much success and much fanfare, actually launched sort of vegan balls that a lot of people love and cherish. And so it's so interesting to see what is possible, what is possible there. But in the book, I do share quite a few tricks also in terms of when you figured out your who and you follow the arrow, and how you can then take that and actually activate that across the marketing mix.
Yeah, great. Niels is asking a question. Usually we talk about large corporates in this context. What role do you think small business can play in all of this? We were sort of talking about that earlier before the webinar started.
Exactly. Fantastic question there, Nelson. It's something I ask myself a lot as well, in terms of my own mission and the role of small business versus big business. And I think there's no real simple answer right now. I think what I'm finally seeing is a lot of small businesses obviously experimenting much more, being able to be a lot more playful, because they don't have suddenly to transform a billion bottles into something that has less of a carbon footprint. So I think smaller businesses, in many ways, in my opinion, are a lot of those who drive some new consumption patterns that show us new sustainable ways. I think we've seen that a lot of times. Mud Jeans is one example from Holland, a jeans company where you sort of rent the jeans or lend the jeans, and all these types of models that are now even in some bigger fashion businesses being adopted. I think one of the key challenges now, if we talk about how we can help ordinary people choose the right or the most sustainable, the most carbon friendly product. And that's I think a lot of us that are the nerds in this community is a conversation I think a lot of us think about, and the challenge there is obviously that a lot of the bigger companies have, the benefit of scale. So if we just look at a company in a singular view and just look at carbon emissions, it might be actually quite difficult for smaller players to compete with that. So I think the important thing is always, when we talk about these things, to take a holistic view on these things, so we don't get too focused on just one metric, but we look at things like, do they pay their fair share of taxes? What's their policies around biodiversity, et cetera, et cetera. So small business are definitely driving a lot of this stuff and pushing a lot of the big ones to move faster, but also to adopt. In the book, I talked with Mark Pritchett about a lot of the stuff they do with being much faster at market. So like trying to almost imitate a startup culture. So instead of having 3 to 4 to 5 year processes, much faster out there, testing it in real life, and then see how that product performs.
Yeah, and you see a lot of the innovation companies teaching that signal to launch in companies like Siemens, and like we're seeing it all over the place. All right, so Lori Penn Moyer has a question. Are there any exercises or specific questions you've led brand leaders through that help guide them through the process of identifying how they can help turn people into heroes in an authentic way?
So yes, so we do have since I have the book here anyways, but I mean a lot of I actually in the foreword to the book I call the book in some ways a tool, because we build it up a lot around sort of now I'm like not hitting any figures, but a lot of like different models and things like that. So I really wanted to create like a way of guiding people to help them find those transformative roles. The real interesting thing is, and where we have the most success, is obviously more of a co-creation process. So actually inviting people in, talking with talking with your customers, um, and interesting enough, depends quite a bit on the industry and the category. But in some categories, there aren't actually a lot of transformative brands, which is a bit surprising. Whereas in other categories, like if you take sport, for example, there's a lot of transformative brands in that category. The Adidas, their thing is about doing sport, it's togetherness. Nike, it's about individualism. Puma is much more about the social aspects. So there's still a lot of transformative roles you can find and use as a really, really clever way of positioning. Because, for example, I thought I was a Nike runner. I thought that that was my thing, but I realized that I don't run to compete with myself or to run further or beat my last round on the 5K. I run because I relax. So in terms of finding a brand that can play a transformative role in my life, I'm actually much more of a Puma type of guy, or because I love that sort of meditative way of looking at it. And I think this is a really good way of being able to launch services and other things on top of your product offering. And there's an amazing case in the book from a brand called Respect Your Universe. And they really found a really, really interesting transformative role to play as a sports retailer, because they said most sports brands cater to the athletes. You go in there and you're already like, if you want to go in there and buy a tennis racket, you already feel a little bit intimidated by the super fit guy or woman. And for Respect Your Universe, the transformative promise that they have is, in fact, no matter what your goals are in life or sport, they're here to help you. And it's just so amazing. I sat with the CEO and he read some of the letters he got from customers. And it could be just a really, really simple thing with someone who actually just wanted to, get off that couch, get on that walk around the lake, and just being happy about that. It didn't have to be about a big athletic accomplishment. So I think there's a lot of stuff, and it really goes back to, and this is something I only realized at the very end of the writing process, was if you think about some of the most valuable brands in the world, they are transformative. So Nike, Apple, all have a transformative promise around, for example, think different or just do it. But I didn't know that when I set out on the journey, but it's almost like a circular thing. We went to talk a lot about the societal difference. I think if we want to save the world, we need to begin figuring out what that means to me as an individual and how I can play my part.
So it's really, what you're describing is really impacting the experience of life we want to have, individuals want to have. And Ashley is making a good point here, that it's important for a small business to focus on and drive one specific thing instead of trying to be everything to everybody. So you look at the Dove example, and that was really about being authentic and being real. You look at the vodka company we were talking about today, which is really regenerative farming and making the most out of what you're using and reusing. So finding what, to go back to Laurie's question, finding what inspires and motivates the audience that you want to engage with and providing ways to support them. Great.
Yeah, but I think in the beginning for me, and especially with the first book and how I used to work with brands back then was quite often a very sort of black and white
Mhm.
radical exercise to say, what's the brand's big fight in this world? We've got to
Yeah.
fight something, plastic waste in the oceans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what I came to realize, and I think especially the whole toxicity we're seeing right now in the marketing landscape, and we see obviously companies being on the front page each and every day for some of those efforts is take Google as an example. Uh, just in the back of when Trump got elected, obviously there was that video that was leaked online where some of the leadership sat there and was immensely disappointed about the outcome of the election.
Mhm.
For me, if a company is truly diverse, you need to be inclusive.
Mhm.
It's not black and white. You should be there for Republicans, for Democrats, whatever political value you have. And that's also why, for me, it's much more important that transformative brands actually look as, for example, the example from United Colors of Bitter Tongue, actually try and go in there and talk about biases and stereotypes, but not put on the hero cape in the same way. I think that's a very I think important point today in the purpose landscape as it is right now.
So unifying and not divisive. Yeah.
Yes, 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 yes. Make it life centric, because the great thing is about the who is that there's so many things that all of us when we go through life are battling with, and I think especially living healthier lives, and if we talk about climate, which is a really really difficult one,
Yeah.
uh, we need help.
Yeah.
And I think people are fed up with brands talking about how great they are. I think, especially if we look at the statistics from young people, I mean, young people want to live more sustainably. They want content that can help them on that journey. It's an open door. I mean, sometimes when I hear marketeers that are like, oh, we're not getting any engagement from the campaigns that we're running.
Right.
And I'm like, you're talking at people, you're not talking
Right.
with people, you're not motivating them, you're not
Right.
driving anything, you're not helping me. And so I think that's a shift in mindset.
Hmm.
And I'm so happy that that question from Ashley in terms of startups, because for me, we have a different side of the company where we work with startups, and it's just so interesting to see what happens when you take that live customer centric focus rather than actually going out and talking too much about the oceans, but rather more about what I can actually do
Yeah.
in terms of thinking about preserving oceans, saving ocean life, etc.
Yeah. And there's a whole line of thinking around brands as community, which is something we can talk about on another webinar. But that's really what you're talking about, is mobilization and interactivity, not brands as a mouthpiece telling you how you should be. And it feels like there was a tipping point during the pandemic when people started to wake up to this even more. And hopefully I want to get to your climate punk thing really quickly before we have to close out. But
Yeah.
but hopefully we're going to start to see some acceleration here. I'm trying to be as positive as I can. But talk to us about climate punk very quickly, and what's that about, and why did you start that? Sounds
I've
radical.
Yeah.
Anything with the word punk in
I felt,
it.
yeah, exactly. I felt a bit disillusioned. I mean, having been in this movement for 15 odd years, and not seeing the progress,
Mhm.
and not seeing that progress happening fast enough. I think, the last report we had came out from the IPCC from all scientists that all agreeing that we should have acted yesterday, and even acting today. The it's a fine line. We're already like breaching some of those planetary boundaries. So somehow I felt a little bit, for the first time in my life, I felt a bit angry, and I felt disillusioned, and felt that I had to do something. And as I said, introductory wise, my early years obviously was in the advertising and marketing industry. This is the industry I know. This is the industry I love, and still believe in that we have an immense role in terms of shifting behaviors and creating those shifts, getting people to understand how they can eat, live, dress, get on a bicycle, all that stuff. Still believe that. But for me, Climate Punk was a way, which goes back to the leadership dimension, and saying all of us, I had this awakening. So basically with Climate Punk is an interview series where I jump on a call like this with different people from different industries who chose to do something about climate. So chefs, activists, and many others. And it's just so interesting to see that we all have a role to play in this.
Yeah.
And some of those conversations around food, I had one of the more sort of interesting figures was Margaret Klein, who comes from the Climate Emergency Fund. And this might be sounding very radical, but basically the Climate Emergency Fund are the ones who backs Climate Extinction Rebellion, a lot of these activist movements we're seeing. And for a very small amount, $10,000, they create global headlines. But having a chat with her about activism, nonviolent activism, having a chat with her about the anxiety a lot of young people feel, and I think for those on this webinar here today that have children and teenagers, you know, I think we see this anxiety more and more. So for me, it was an outlet for me to say, maybe I need to be a bit more angry. Maybe I really need to say, this is a time to act. We talked for a long time. This is about unlocking change. And so for me, that's my, that's my little pet project at the moment, my little petri dish in terms of figuring out how we move forward faster.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to seeing how that evolves and following that work. So Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time today. And for our guests, thank you so much for joining us. You can connect with Thomas at thomaskolster.com. You can also learn more about his point of view. We talked to him on our podcast. So go to wherever you get your podcasts and look for the Future Ready CMO podcast. And the episode with Thomas is there. If you're interested in learning more about the Future Ready CMO community, you can visit our website at futurereadycmo.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, and please keep in touch and keep the movement rolling. Bye.